The afternoon sun touched the airport windows, covering the floors in soft golden light. Travelers rushed in every direction, some dragging suitcases, some hugging loved ones, some staring at their phones with tired faces. In the middle of this ordinary day, one man walked quietly through the arrival terminal. His steps were slow but steady, his posture straight, and his face calm. His name was James Walters. He was not just another traveler. He was a man whose name many knew, but whose story few truly understood. James had served his country many years ago. He was a veteran, a man who had worn the uniform with pride. Over his heart, once pinned with the nation's highest honor, was the symbol of bravery and sacrifice. But James never liked to talk about awards. To him, his medal was not about glory, it was about the people he served with and the life he had lived. That day, James carried only one bag, a simple, old duffel bag made of thick green fabric. The edges were frayed, the zipper slightly bent. If anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed initials stitched in faded black thread. JW. This bag had been with him for decades. It had traveled through airports, bus stations, train platforms, and even quiet country roads. Inside it were just a few clothes, a folded newspaper, a book he liked to reread, and a photograph he kept close to his heart. He believed in living simply. James didn't dress like a famous man. He wore a plain blue shirt, a pair of old trousers, and a hat with a small pin on it, an emblem that only a few would recognize. To most people passing by, he was just an elderly man arriving home. But those who looked carefully might have seen something different in his eyes: calmness, kindness, and quiet strength. When James reached the customs area, the line was already long. People sighed and checked their watches. A family of 4 tried to keep their excited children close. A young couple whispered and laughed softly. Some travelers were clearly tired after long flights. James waited patiently. He was used to waiting. He had spent years in situations where patience was more powerful than rushing. He didn't complain, didn't sigh, didn't frown. He just stood there, holding the strap of his old duffel bag, with a quiet smile on his face. Behind the counter stood a young customs officer named Daniel. Daniel was in his mid-20s, new to the job, and determined to do everything exactly by the book. His uniform was perfectly neat, his shoes polished, his badge shining. It was only his 3rd week on the job, and he wanted to make a good impression. Every traveler who came through was processed carefully. He checked every bag, every passport, every form. He believed rules kept everything fair and safe. When it was finally James's turn, Daniel greeted him with a polite but firm, "Good afternoon, sir. May I see your documents?" James handed over his passport and customs form. His hands were steady. Daniel scanned the documents, looked at the bag, and then glanced at the scale beside him. "Sir, I'll need to weigh your bag," Daniel said. James nodded calmly and placed the duffel on the scale. The small digital screen beeped and showed a number slightly over the allowed limit. It wasn't much, just a few pounds over, but rules were rules. Daniel checked the guidelines again, then looked back at James with an apologetic but firm expression. "Sir," Daniel said carefully, "your bag is a little overweight. There'll be a small extra fee for it." James smiled gently. "I see," he replied softly. There was no anger in his voice, no protest. He simply reached into his pocket for his wallet. Behind him, a few people in line watched with mild impatience. They just wanted the line to move faster. Some looked at the old man with a bit of sympathy, others with no thought at all. Airports are busy places. People often forget that every face they pass belongs to a story. Daniel tapped a few buttons on his small machine and printed out a slip. "That'll be the amount, sir," he said, holding the paper toward him. James pulled out a few folded bills from his wallet. The wallet was old too, soft at the corners and worn from years of use. As he handed over the money, his hand trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from age. Daniel took the money and placed it in the register, not realizing who he was talking to. To him, James was just another passenger, a few counters away. Another officer named Lisa was processing a family returning from vacation. She glanced up for a moment and noticed the old man with the hat. Something about the pin on his hat caught her attention. She had seen that emblem before in a book during training. Her father, a history teacher, had once told her about men who wore that emblem. They were not ordinary travelers. Lisa leaned a little closer, squinting at the name on the customs form, James Walters. Her heart skipped. She thought she recognized the name from somewhere, a story, a ceremony, or maybe an article she had read, but she wasn't sure. Meanwhile, James finished paying and picked up his duffel bag again. He didn't look upset. In fact, he thanked Daniel for doing his job. That surprised Daniel a little. Most people complained about fees. Some even got angry. But this old man just smiled. "Thank you, sir," Daniel said, slightly confused by the man's kindness. "Have a good day." James gave a small nod and stepped aside to adjust the strap of his bag. The line behind him moved forward. The moment seemed ordinary. A fee was paid. A passenger walked on. But something small was already starting to change. Lisa quickly turned to her supervisor, Mark, who was checking a nearby terminal. "Mark," she whispered urgently, "look at that man over there." Mark glanced up. "What about him?" "His name's James Walters," Lisa said. I think he's not just anyone." Mark frowned slightly, curious. He walked closer, pretending to check the flow of passengers. As he approached, he got a better look at the man's face. There was a quiet dignity about him, something he had seen only a few times before in parades, in ceremonies, in stories told on national holidays. Mark walked back to the counter and checked the system. A few quick keystrokes confirmed what Lisa had suspected. His eyes widened slightly. He leaned closer to Lisa and said quietly, "He's a Medal of Honor recipient." Lisa's breath caught. "Are you serious?" Mark nodded. "Yes, that's the James Walters." They both looked back at the old man, now slowly walking toward the exit with his heavy bag on his shoulder. He moved with calm grace, unaware of the sudden attention. Round him, travelers hurried past without a second glance. Most had no idea who he was. They didn't know that the man passing quietly through the terminal had once stood at the center of history. At the original counter, Daniel was still processing other passengers. He hadn't heard the quiet conversation between Lisa and Mark. He didn't know that the man he had just charged a fee to was someone many people deeply respected. Lisa whispered, "Should we tell him?" Mark shook his head thoughtfully. "Not yet. Let's do this the right way." Meanwhile, James sat down on a nearby bench to rest for a moment. His flight had been long, and though he was strong, he was not young anymore. He set the duffel beside him and watched people rush by. He loved watching people in airports. He saw mothers carrying children, teenagers with headphones, business people with briefcases, and friends hugging tightly. Every traveler was part of a story. Just like him, he wasn't a man who liked attention. He had spent his life believing that the greatest acts of service were often quiet. He never expected anyone to treat him differently because of what he had done. Paying a small fee for his bag didn't bother him at all. Rules were rules, and he respected people who did their jobs with honesty. But this ordinary moment was about to turn into something very different. At the counter, Daniel finally finished his line. Mark approached him with a serious but calm expression. "Daniel," Mark said quietly, "do you know who that man was?" Daniel blinked. Just a passenger with an overweight bag?" Mark placed a hand on his shoulder. "That was James Walters, Medal of Honor recipient." Daniel froze for a second. "Wait, what? Are you sure?" "Yes," Mark nodded. "Completely sure." Daniel's face turned pale. He looked toward the bench where the old man sat. He felt his heart beat faster. He replayed the moment in his head, how he had asked the man to pay the fee, how he had taken the money, how the man had simply smiled. He hadn't recognized him. How could he? James wasn't wearing a uniform or a big medal. He looked like an ordinary traveler. But EWAS in single quotes T. Lisa gently said, "Don't blame yourself. You didn't do anything wrong." He didn't want special treatment. Daniel nodded slowly, but his stomach still twisted with unease. He respected people who served the country. His own grandfather had been a veteran. If he had known, he would have at least said something kind. Instead, he had just treated him like anyone else, not out of disrespect, but out of routine. Mark said, "We're going to make this right." Back on the bench, James checked his watch and adjusted his hat. A little girl passed by with her mother and looked up at him. She pointed at the pin on his hat and asked, "What's that?" James smiled gently. "It's something I was given a long time ago." The mother smiled politely and nodded in respect, even if she didn't fully understand. The little girl waved, and James waved back across the terminal. Mark made a quick call to the airport's public service team. A quiet plan started forming. Lisa went to find someone from the passenger service department. Daniel stayed at the counter, feeling a strange mix of nervousness and hope. He didn't want the old man to leave without them showing their respect. James stood up slowly and began walking toward the exit. The soft clapping slowly grew louder, filling the terminal with a sound that was not rushed but heartfelt. Travelers who had been tired moments ago now stood taller. Some lifted their phones to record, others simply placed a hand over their chest. Children looked around, curious, sensing something special was happening. Airport staff gathered closer, their uniforms neatly pressed, their faces glowing with quiet respect. James stood in the middle of it all, slightly surprised but calm. His eyes moved slowly across the faces around him. He had never expected attention. He was the kind of man who believed in doing his duty without expecting anything in return. All he wanted that day was to go home with his old duffel bag, maybe make a cup of tea, and enjoy a quiet evening. But life had other plans. Mark stepped forward first. His voice was steady, respectful, and warm. "Mr. Walters," he said, "on behalf of everyone here, welcome home. It's an honor to have you here. Your service and your story are not forgotten." James gave a small smile. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of years of quiet strength. "Daniel." The young customs officer who had unknowingly charged him the fee earlier stood near the counter. His heart was beating fast. He had done nothing wrong, but still, he felt something inside him stir. Respect, maybe, admiration, a deep wish to make things right. He slowly stepped forward, his hands slightly shaking. "Sir," Daniel said gently, "I'm sorry. I didn't recognize you earlier. I was just following the rules." James looked at him with kind eyes. "Son," he said, "you did exactly what you were supposed to. Don't ever be sorry for doing the right thing." "I respect that." Daniel blinked. He hadn't expected that answer. He had expected anger, or at least a correction. But instead, this man, the kind of man who had done extraordinary things, was thanking him. Something shifted inside Daniel at that moment. It was the kind of lesson no training manual could teach. Lisa came forward next, holding a small bouquet of flowers. Her hands were steady, but her heart was full. She had grown up hearing stories about people like James Walters, brave people, who had changed history with their quiet strength. To meet one in real life was something she would never forget. "Sir," she said softly, handing him the flowers, "thank you for everything." James accepted the bouquet carefully, almost shyly. "You don't need to thank me," he replied with a gentle smile. "I was just doing my part." All around them, people had gathered in a circle, some standing on their tiptoes to get a better view. A little boy sitting on his father's shoulders asked in a whisper, "Dad, who is he?" His father answered quietly, "He's a hero, son." The word hero felt strange to James. He had never liked it. To him, a hero was someone else, someone who didn't make it back. But in that moment, he understood that the people weren't just clapping for him, they were clapping for everything. And everyone he represented. The airport supervisor, Mark, gestured to Daniel, and together they walked to the service desk. Daniel opened the small cash register and carefully took out the amount James had paid earlier. He didn't just want to give the money back. He wanted to do it properly. They returned to where James was standing. Daniel held out the cash with both hands, not as an officer, but as a young man showing respect. "Sir," he said, his voice firm now, "we'd like to return this. You shouldn't have had to pay." James looked down at the money and then back at Daniel. For a second, he considered refusing. He didn't believe in special treatment. But when he saw the respect in Daniel's eyes, not pity, but genuine honor, he understood that accepting it wasn't about him. It was about the meaning behind the gesture. He smiled softly and took the cash. "Thank you," he said, "but remember, rules are important. Always follow them." Daniel nodded slowly. That simple sentence would stay with him for the rest of his life. Someone from the airport team walked over with a small gift bag. Inside it was a polished airport pin, a card signed by several employees, an A-voucher for free service. It wasn't much, but it was their way of saying thank you. Lisa handed it to him gently. "This is just a little something from all of us," she said, her smile warm. James accepted it carefully, clearly moved. "You're all very kind," he said softly. The applause began again, this time even louder. Some people cheered softly. Others simply stood in silence, their eyes shining. No one rushed. It was a rare moment in a busy place where time seemed to slow down. As James looked around, he saw people of all ages, different backgrounds, different lives, united in one simple moment of respect. That touched him deeply. He felt his throat tighten a little, and his eyes grew warm. He wasn't used to crying in public, but the kindness of strangers was something that reached him in a way medals never could. Then something unexpected happened. Daniel stepped back, straightened his posture, and raised his hand in a respectful salute. His movements were sharp but full of emotion. It wasn't an official salute, it was personal. It was a gesture from one man to another. James slowly straightened too. His body may have aged, but his discipline never left him. He returned the salute, steady and proud. The two men stood like that for a moment, surrounded by silence, and then the clapping came again. A few travelers approached slowly. One woman, holding her baby, whispered, "Thank you, sir," before walking away with a grateful smile. An older man shook his hand with quiet reverence. A teenage boy, nervous but inspired, asked for a picture. James usually didn't like pictures, but this time he nodded. Not because he wanted to be in the spotlight, but because he knew it might inspire someone. Soon, a small line of people formed, not to bother him, but to shake his hand or simply say thank you. Some said it softly, others with tears in their eyes. Each thank you felt different, real, and full of heart. The little girl from earlier ran up with her mother. She looked at him with bright eyes and said, "You're a real hero." James crouched down slightly so they were at the same level. "A hero," he said gently, "is someone who chooses kindness every day. You can be one too." The girl grinned and nodded proudly. It was a small conversation, but one she might remember for a long time. Meanwhile, Daniel stepped to the side, watching everything unfold. He had processed hundreds of passengers during his short time on the job. Most left without remembering his face. But he knew he would remember this day forever. It wasn't just about meeting someone famous. It was about learning something powerful: how quiet strength, humility, and kindness could change the air in a crowded room. Mark, standing nearby, felt the same. As a supervisor, he had seen frustrated travelers, long lines, and endless paperwork. But this moment reminded him why respect mattered. It wasn't about big speeches. It was about simple gestures. Eventually, the crowd began to thin as flights were called and travelers returned to their journeys. Some still looked back over their shoulders as they walked away, smiling softly as if they had witnessed something rare. Lisa returned with a wheelchair just in case James needed it, but he waved it off politely. "Thank you," he said kindly, "but I can walk just fine." She smiled. "I had a feeling you'd say that." They all laughed softly. The atmosphere had changed. The space that usually felt rushed and tense now felt calm and warm. Daniel walked over one last time. He hesitated for a moment, then spoke honestly. "Sir, meeting you today, it means more to me than I can say." James put a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Then make it mean something," he said with a soft smile. "Keep doing your job with heart, respect people, and always stay kind." Daniel nodded. It wasn't a speech with big words. It was something simple, but it carried more weight than anything he'd learned in training. James picked up his old duffel bag again. It looked a little heavier than before, but his steps were light. He turned toward the exit, waving to the small group of staff who had gathered. They waved back with wide smiles. As he walked through the terminal, People moved aside, not because they were told to, but out of quiet respect. It wasn't a grand ceremony. There were no cameras flashing, but it was something more meaningful, ordinary people recognizing extraordinary grace. At the automatic doors, James paused for a moment. The warm air from outside touched his face. He looked back over his shoulder at the people who had gathered. A few were still watching. Daniel was among them, standing tall. Lisa and Mark stood beside him, proud and happy. The moment felt like a gentle reminder that kindness doesn't need to be planned. It just needs to be shared. He smiled one last time and walked out into the sunlight outside. A car waited to pick him up. The driver, a young man, opened the door and helped him with his bag. "You look like you had quite the welcome, sir," the driver said with a grin. James chuckled softly. "I suppose I did." As the car drove away, the airport faded behind him, but the feeling stayed in the air, a quiet wave of respect left behind like a soft echo. Inside the terminal, people went back to their flights, their luggage, their waiting. But something had changed. They carried with them a story, a moment they would tell others. Daniel, back at his counter, processed the next passenger. But his voice was different now, calmer, warmer. Lisa couldn't stop smiling. Mark made a note in the airport's daily report. Today, something special happened, and James, sitting quietly in the back seat of the car, looked down at the bouquet of flowers in his lap. He touched the petals gently, thinking not about medals or applause, but about kindness.